Hi everyone, welcome to this week. Sorry about the video format, but probably it's good to go through things a little bit slower and just explain things. Especially this week, we're looking at using images in your website and just a little bit of work on optimizing those images, some work on doing wireframing, and hopefully we'll be looking at some getting some nice fonts into your sites. So let's go, and have any questions, feel free to email me, hit me up on Slack, whatever it is, and I'm happy to answer questions. So let's make a start. So what we have here is the Instagram, it's an old Instagram page, and you can see that what makes this mobile site work. Just a few things. I mean, Instagram is a fairly simple in terms of structure like this, but it really is about how the whole site flows together. So in this example with the on the left here, when you've got that whole range of images and text down there, it really does make for a nice rhythm as you scroll up, and you can see that the image really takes the most important precedence as you're going through this site. The reason being is that Instagram is a visual way of representing people's lives and whatever they want to put up. So the images are really important to get them as big and as center focused as possible. And because Instagram's designed for mobile, it is important that the images really are as big as they possibly can be in that particular format. And part of that experience of using Instagram, this is an older version of it, but you have consistent navigation across the top. Images are always optimized to the maximum width of the browser, and icons, for interaction and engagement. So the really front and center is this idea that you can engage with the images and the instant gratification, so people can see how many likes they have. Obviously now, because of privacy, that just says others, but there's also information on who's commenting and feedback. And this is really makes this site work so well, and in terms of mobile experience, that they spend a lot of time getting this right. And this is kind of a later version from this year, and you can see that they've kind of refined it, but they've also included stories, which is a way of doing Instagram posts, and pretty much the same thing, but it really has been refined and simplified and looks a lot cleaner, especially when it's in this dark mode. And these are the key takeaways. Why does this site work? Images are optimized, text is well designed, well considered, good use of icons, good use of layer, consistency, rhythm, and the fonts chosen. Makes it very legible and very easy to navigate. Here's a few more examples. As you can see, the topography really is important in establishing a mood and a feeling within this particular site. The Mali Culver text looks really appropriate, nice spacing. Spacing is one of those things that is so understated that unless it's done badly, you won't notice it. But because it's been done so well here, like the vertical spacing between the text, the heading, between the text and the image, perhaps the thing that drives me nuts a little bit is the fact that image isn't centered, so it doesn't line up on the left and the right. The actual black bar does, but the actual image itself doesn't. And as a designer, this kind of triggers me a little bit. But anyway, that's my problem, not yours. But topography is one of those things that we really need to consider when we're looking at doing a mobile design, because really when you're only working with text and images, that's really one of the key design elements that we can use to help our design work well in this vertical format. Okay, and as we move on, you can see there's another example here of really bringing images to the fore, and the only way we can really do that is to make them as wide as the browser window. Once again, I get a little bit triggered by center-aligned paragraph text. As English readers, we read left to right, so that means that we're looking for a border down the left to align our vision to when we go back to the beginning of the line. Fine, I think, for headings, but just be a little bit careful that when you have a centre-aligned paragraph text like that, it does make reading a little bit more difficult. Certainly, never use justified text because the browser doesn't understand hyphenation or spacing. So what it'll do, it'll just put space between the words, and that means that we'll actually get these rivers of white space through our design. So as it goes down vertically, you can see that we're getting these spaces between the words because the browser doesn't understand letter spacing in terms of how to break that paragraph up properly. What we're going to do today is just start gathering and preparing some images. So we want to have for you guys just to go and pick some images, just a couple of images, do a bit of a wireframe exercise, which I'll go through in a second, optimize those images, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Google Fonts and how to include them in your first assignment. So at this point, we're just going to talk a little bit about wireframing and why it's important. Wireframing is a process that we go through when we're starting to look at the design of a site. Why is wireframing important? What do we need to consider when planning it? Really, a wireframe is a simple way that we can visually demonstrate what our site is going to look like. And really it's about highlighting that basic functionality. Where do things link to, how big are our images, how we consider the spacing of the vertical spacing through the use of just very simple mechanisms to enable you to just visually show without having to do any coding, really, and show your client or whomever and how your site is going to work. It really makes it easy to identify, your information hierarchy, where things go, how things are supposed to link, what's the content like. And what it does, it allows you to do all this work before putting any code onto your page. And, you can plan your site structure around your wireframe, but you can also plan, where an article is going to go, where a section is going to go, asides, that kind of thing. So it really is a multifunctional way of providing yourself and your client a visual representation of how this site's going to work. When you get out into the world as a client-focused exercise, then being able to do things without costing the client money is really important. So you can nail down those concepts that you have, those ideas, and then you can talk through all those kind of decisions that you make when you're considering creating a site. And it's much better to do that visually and cheaply, and also quickly, without having to do too much coding before you get into the actual process of building that site out. So you can see here we're just drawing some really basic ideas on how things work in the vertical format. You notice that I'm just using really rough, quick ways of defining where things are going to sit. So this is kind of a basic premise around how we start designing with a wireframe. Here's an example of the kind of things that we'll be doing, probably more for assignment 2, but it's just good to start you thinking in terms of wireframing, sketching, and just really nailing down your concept before you start coding. Okay, so now it's your turn. So what we want you to do is just to go onto unsplash.com, grab a couple of images and download them, and then we'll go through this optimization process, and I'll try and explain the differences between the different formats and which format you need to use in order to get the best browser response and also the best download time, because there are differences between using JPEG, PNG, GIF and SVG, but we'll just get those JPEGs first and then we'll start from there. Now we'll go to the Unsplash site and just do a search term. Obviously I'll be looking up motorbikes, and you can actually select one that you like, and then you just hit the download button and it'll come down onto your machine. And you can also just copy this attribution, because it's always good just to put that in as a caption, or even as a comment, just so that there's some attribution on that image. And it's just a way of thanking that particular user that you've actually used their image. And What we'll do is once we've got this downloaded, I'll open up in Photoshop and we'll go through a few processes there, and also perhaps some alternatives to Photoshop, because not everybody has that installed now because of the if you're working from home, it's expensive. So we'll have a look at a couple of options. There are basically two kinds of image format that we can use. One is lossy and one is lossless. One question we need to ask ourselves is, why do we make the images smaller? And really because once you start downloading files from your phone or from a data plan, you don't want people to have to download large images. And the other really is the speed. If you can get the speed up for your website, then it makes it a much better experience for your user. A lot of good sites will actually be quite quick as well because they've been optimized to perform. Compression is always a compromise between image quality and file size. Lossy will actually take pixels out of your image to reduce the size of it. Lossless compression algorithms are best for flat color and logos. In general terms, there are two kinds of image compression, or a couple of kinds of formats that we can address for uploading to the web and using in our sites. One is JPEG and the other is lossless, or example would be a PNG file, a GIF file, and the third one is an SVG file. Now the differences between them will kind of dictate as to what purpose they're used for. JPEGs are used for photographs because what happens is that the algorithm will remove pixels based on the amount of compression you put on it, and this can lead to images that look a little bit jagged with artifacts, because what's happening is that the information that you're looking at is actually being removed. This means that higher compression is equal to a degradation of the image. And one thing with JPEGs, when you're creating your files, don't keep saving the JPEG in the same file, because what happens is that the compression algorithm will actually keep removing information. So each time you save that file, you'll find that you're reducing the quality. And this can have an effect, on your overall quality image. So have one base file, for example, a PSD file or a high-res JPEG, and then just make copies from that rather than actually reduce keep saving over the same file, because you will lose a lot of quality. The other one is lossless, where things like logos, solid blocks of color are better suited for this, because with lossless, it's basically saying rather than giving each pixel a value, it's saying, okay, I have this value, and then there are 5,000 pixels that are exactly the same color. And so rather than say this value, it'll say this value times 5,000. So that's how it compresses. It's called run line length compression, and that's really suited for solid colors, where the algorithm can just take one color and then repeat it, and it's much better than that. It's better to use that than JPEG. What you'll find is if you have solid colors, JPEG will actually introduce artifacts into that mix, and by doing that, you're reducing your quality. You can save images, photographs with PNG, but you find that it's about 5 times the file size. So really, photographs for JPEG and logos, solid color elements are best for PNG, for example. The other advantage of PNG, of course, is that we have transparency, because transparency means that around the actual pixels there's a transparent area, so you can actually overlay this on top of background images, for example, and this means that it's really good for having a background image and then having a logo over the top of an image by having a transparent background. The other format is SVG, which refers to a scalable vector graphic. Now, if you've done any work with Illustrator or these sort of drawing programs, you use points. Basically, points enable you to describe a shape using paths rather than pixel values. So that means that you can create quite a small SVG, and then you can scale that up to any size you want, and you won't lose any quality. You can make it as big as you like, and it still retains its integrity even though it's quite large. So SVG is really good for logos, for things with shapes and things like that. In this illustration you can see that on the left you've got the image, and on the right you've got the code that describes that. So it's all based on paths and points. GIF is a similar format, is a lossless format, but you're limited to 256 colours. And the advantage of GIF is that you can animate it, and you can do the same thing in PNG. So PNG is probably the de facto now. PNG all the time because you've got transparency, plus you've got a much broader range of colours. This is a short test for yourself. Just have a look at this image and see if you can work out which format you would use. Obviously if it's a photograph it would be JPEG. If you have solid colour or logos with solid colour, or you want transparency, then a PNG. You notice that you've got the logo on the bike itself, so that would be a PNG. Always use the appropriate format for what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so I've just brought this image into Photos on a Mac. I'm sure there's a similar process you can go through on a PC, but with a Mac you can just go up to Edit. So you can actually edit this photo. This is just one that I've downloaded. You can edit this to the way that you like it. Maybe you don't like colours, however, so you can change it however you like. So I'll make it a little bit different. Once we click done, it'll save a version. Once we have our image changed, we can go up to File and go to Export. So export one photo, and the way that we can change it is we have maximum JPEG quality, the color profile. So let's just make this a medium, and the size, so we can change the size, make it a custom size. However we want to change the size of this image, so we can do this in Photos fairly easily, and you'll find a way to get in there, export it, and then your image is ready for putting it to your website. And the other alternative is to go to Photoshop. So I've got the similar image here in Photoshop. You can see that it's really quite high resolution, and to export this we just go up to File, Export, Export As, and this gives you this sort of window here which allows you to look at the image and say the image size is 6000 by 4000. Now that's too big for web images, and what it does, it shows you the size over here. So this is 5.7 meg, which we don't want for web, obviously. So the recommendation is 1024 pixels wide. Okay, hit tab, and now it'll calculate the size, and over here you can see it's 536K. Now if we blow this up a bit, okay, so you see that the image is pretty good. So because it's on 100% quality, that means that there's limited compression here. Now just watch what happens when I change this to, say, bring it down to, say, 20%. Okay, so watch the file size. Now you notice that the file size is now 70K, but you can see down here you're starting to introduce some artifacts, which is what we don't want, because that really reduces the quality of that image. So we try and go compromise. So let's go to somewhere around about, I don't know, 70%. And now you notice it's half the size, so it's 230K, but those artifacts have gone. So this is kind of where we're talking about having a compromise between image quality and file size. I would say this as a JPEG that is lower in size, but certainly pretty high in quality. You can tweak this a bit further. So once you start getting back here, now it's gone down to 100K, and can you live with these kind of small artifacts here? It looks a bit sort of out of focus, looks a bit furry. When you compare that to the 100%, okay, you notice it's a lot smoother. So this is how we kind of work through and have that compromise of file size and image quality. Then you just hit export, save it to your images folder, and go from there. Okay, in this example I've just taken the bitmap, or sorry, in this example I've just taken the vector that I'd used before, and I've just brought that into Photoshop, and you can see that, you know, because we've got this checkered layer here, that means that this area is transparent. So if we were to put, say, a background on here, so I can just add a flat color, stick that behind there, you'll see that now we've got this nice way of, you know, having transparent pixels in there. And when we have this kind of image, we can actually save this as a PNG. So exactly the same process. Save, go to export, export as, and here you just need to make sure that instead of having JPEG selected, you've actually got PNG, and you've ticked transparency. So if we turn off transparency, then it just becomes another image, like a JPEG. Now at the moment this is a 24-bit image, or you can make it an 8-bit image. So as before, I said that with GIF you can make that that format is an 8-bit format, so you've got 256 colors. With PNG you can have up to full 24-bit colors with transparency, but I mean most of the time we keep it at that size. Now you can see that this is 53K. Okay, so this is a PNG. If we change this to a JPEG, right, we lose our transparency, but you'll notice that the actual file size is larger because it has to take into account all of those pixels. Whereas if we use a lossless format and make that a PNG, it now goes down to 53K. If we change that to a GIF file, okay, it goes down to 21K because we've lost a lot of color information. But I mean, it still looks fine. I mean, we can even, because there's only like 3 or 4 colors in this image, it actually aligns pretty well to 8-bit color, so we can actually make it smaller, and the equivalent PNG size is actually 17K, so it's smaller than a GIF file. So these are the kind of decisions that you can make on the fly. I wouldn't probably recommend that you use GIF files for images anymore. It is much better to go with PNG because the file size is smaller and it's a much more modern format. So here are just some examples of how you can do this same kind of thing through Photos and on a PC. Okay, so now it's your turn. I just want you to go into CodePen, and we've got a link there, so just click on that link. Okay, so we're in CodePen. I've just put an image in here, just through, if I just go here. So you got your basic context that you've copied from that file, and what I'll do is I'll just add an asset. Now obviously, you know, if you're doing your own website, these are sort of the images from your own site. Oops. Search for that. Okay, so I've got a couple of images here, and yeah, I kind of like that one. So what I want to do is get the full size, so copy as image full. So what I'd like to do is just sort of start looking at a few of these things. Now you'll notice that I've got this class up here. Now what classes do, classes and IDs, I didn't go through this last week, but classes and IDs allow you to distinguish content from other content, and to allow you to actually lay out your site using more they allow you to design your site using content areas. So let's do some basic housekeeping here. So we do a H1 and we say font size is say 50 pixels. Okay, there's our large heading, and I want to use our article. So article, and I want a background on that. I can type. Okay, and padding say 20 pixels. And what I want to talk about now is just the way that we can drill down into various elements within a particular element. So if I do something like article H1 and I do font size 100 pixels, because of the way that CSS works, you're reading from sort of top to bottom, so it's whatever's at the top is read first, and as you move further down the CSS page, you're actually overriding these things. And this is called, this is part of the cascade. I'm not going to get into the cascade probably till next week just to explain the differences, but just bear in mind that whenever you type in something that's lower in that document, it overrides what comes before. Now this idea of having a hierarchy where your article and your H1, I'm actually targeting this H1 here. So it's article H1. So every single article that I produce, so if I do, actually we'll make it a H2, I think that would be better because we don't use more than one H1. Okay, so now we can see that even though it is a H2, it's visually it's larger than this one. So this means that every single article on my page and that has a H2, the font will be this size. So just watch if I do another article here. Okay, so article, and I won't put a class on this one. Okay. Okay, so I'll just keep, I'll just put some text in here. All right, and I'll just close off this article. All right, so now you can see that we should have, look at this heading down here. What I'll do, I'll leave that where it is. All right, so you can see that it's exactly the same. Now, this means that every single article with a H2 will have this particular formatting. If we put a background on here, okay, and so now you can see that we have this orange background on both of those H2s. I'm just going to hide this image just so you can see this a bit clearer. And once again, we use our display rule to display none. Okay, so we have two articles. So H2 in these two articles is exactly the same. Now we can use a class to differentiate those two articles. Okay, so if we only want the article with this class to have the yellow background, all we need to do is do content in there, depending on how the browser decides to render that. It can be a bit of a problem sometimes. I mean, to really access it, you could just put article and then content. So that all that means is that it's targeting the article dot and then the name of this class. So this name here and this have to be exactly the same. So I can just do content there. So what classes allow you to do is customize your content, your structural areas. So if we did, instead of doing yellow, we made this light blue. Okay, so we've still got our yellow background, but what this means is that every single article with this class we can change based on the content that we want in there. So the power of using classes is that it allows you to differentiate different areas of content. Now the other thing that we can do is what's called an ID, and an ID is a little bit different in that an ID can only be used once on a page, but it has a higher browser specificity. So specificity is really referring to, it's based on a point system. It's a bit sort of complicated, but it's based on a point system. So a class has so many points, an ID has more points, in that the browser will actually uniquely identify that particular name. So that means you have a little bit more power in terms of formatting it. But the thing is with IDs, you can only use them once on a page, and you can't use them multiple times. Commonly used for things like slideshows, things where you really need to target a particular content area, and this gives you the most power. So if we do an ID on this one, you would do it the same format. So instead of saying class, it would be ID content, so pull quote. Alright, so maybe I only want one of these on the page, and then to access that we would actually do, so all we need to do here is just do content pull quote, and you can see that this allows us to really contain and target that particular area. Okay, so you've got some images into your little mini website, the one that you've just done the wireframing for, and now we're just going to look at how we can control these images within that mobile environment. Some of the key properties that we'll be looking at will be the height, the width, max height and max width, border and opacity. So they're the main areas where we want to look at our how we control the sizing of our images. When you're looking at responsive websites, the max width is possibly the most important, but there's some extra properties like minimum height, min width, object fit and object position. Now the object fit and object position are a little bit more advanced, so there will be an example, but no one's expecting you to have a go at those. They're not that hard. They just allow you to basically crop your image as opposed to resizing it to the width of the container. Okay, so I've set this up with some images. Now on the version that you've got, it's going to go out to the full width of the browser, but just for demonstration purposes, what I've done is I've just put using a divisional tag, an element, and then I'll just put main content and then wrapped up my entire page with this div tag. So if I turn that off, it's just a way of, so I've got some CSS for it down here. If I actually comment that out, you'll notice that it just goes out to the full width, but because I'm recording the video, I just wanted to make it a bit easier so we can just look at it in one column. So let's go back here. So we can see how you can use classes to, to basically wrap things up in a divisional tag. And that's kind of one of the purposes of using a division tag, is just to give you some extra leverage in terms of how you present things. Obviously if this was a mobile site, it would go out to the full width. Now what's happening here is that we have our the main content is 50%, but the margin is set to 0 top and bottom and auto left and right. So that means that the extra space from the automatic means that it takes the width of the browser, then the width of this main content area, which is 50%, and then divides it and puts it each side. So if I drag this in, you notice that our complete column gets a bit narrower because it's taking 50% of the width of this area here rather than the width of the over here. Now when you start looking at your image sizes, there's a few things that we can do to change that, and we have a few options in regards to width and height. when we start to look at how we're going to size our elements within our page, we need to look at a few of these width and height property aspects. So we can do this by doing automatic width. So if we look at the trial, so auto width is really the default. So we probably don't need to worry too much about that, because obviously it's just going to fill out to the width of the browser. In this second example, it's been set to a pixel value. So if we go back to our example, we can set a pixel value for a width of our page here. So if we make that 300, or say 400 pixels. Okay, so that's a physical absolute measurement system. It's probably good a time as any to start talking about how we use the different measurement units. So if we go to here, you can see that we've got centimeters, millimeters, inches, pixels, points and picas. Now points and picas probably don't mean anything to you, but because I've come from a print background, they're actually what I used to measure. Pages and page layout, typography have all been based around points and picas. Interesting is that they're all based on 1 point is 1/72 of an inch, and if you have a Mac, then your screen is set to 72 pixels per inch. So there's a correlation between points and pixels. And when desktop publishing first came in, that was the thing, was what you see is what you get. So everything was based on the printing point system, and that's where M's come from as well. So they are absolute length, so pixels, so you can qualify these in whatever you like in CSS. Where points come in handy is if you're doing another style sheet for a print style sheet, and then you can specify point sizes. If you go to Word or something, you'll see you've got 12 point, 10 point, 18 point, 24 point. Those sizes aren't arbitrary. They're actually based on what the printing industry used to use for headings and paragraphs. So with CSS, you also have relative length. So M's are based on a square of the letter M in the point size. So if you have, say, 20 point or 20 pixel text, then 1M is 20 by 20. So when you start looking at relative lengths, if you say that you want your font size to be 2M, it'll be 2 times the size of the containing element. A little bit more on that in a second. X is based on the X height of the current font, which is really the line. If you draw a horizontal line across a line of text, so I'll show you this example. This is actually up on Blackboard as well in the notes. A really good site if you want to learn a little bit more about typography. So it shows you the elements of typography. So that vertical line is called a stem. The serif is the little dog's ear, or that little area in here. That's called a bar, and you can actually click on these and find a bit more out about what they are. So here's our X height here. So that measurement is based on the height of this, the lowercase character. Okay, so have a look through these. These are really handy to look through. The reason why we have serifs are kind of a more traditional style of typography, because when text is small, the feet, these little serifs along the bottom, along the top here, actually help you to go from character to character. So they give you this alignment. Otherwise, if you look at a really small sans serif font, it doesn't have the same legibility. So when you're looking at typography, there is always a reason why something's been done. So like if you look at the counter, then that's just that area inside the O. So always good to see where this comes from. Now, so we don't use X very much. Rem is relative, is like an M, except it's taken the font size from the root element. So for example, if you put in body text, if you put body font size is 16 pixels, then all of your measurements that you do, all your relative measurements in your document will be based on that number. So if you had 2M for something, it will be 32 pixels. Okay, so VW is really handy for responsive. What it does, it gives you a percentage of the width of the viewport. So if you say something's 50%, for example, if I come in here and I say width is, say, 50 VW, then it will take in 50% of that area. So it's the horizontal width. It's 50% of the viewport window. And we can do likewise if we did height is 50 VH, then you can see this is our main content here. So you can see that it's now 50% of the height of this this window, this viewport window. Okay, so that's really handy to know, especially when you're talking about using it for images, because if you make your containing element a certain width in comparison to the viewport, then your image will fill that containing element. So percentage is one of the most common ways that we can define space, because what it does, it's a relative value. So if we say, for example, our image, so this is our image tag here. If we say down here, width is 50%, okay, then our images will be 50% of their containing element. Alright, so when it comes to doing things for mobile, percentage is probably the most flexible. Okay, so we put a width in here. We're just going to get rid of that. Now, what we can do is have what are called max width and max height, min width. So the way that these work is that with max width, when you have a containing element, so our containing element, let's delete that. If we look at our HTML, we have a portfolio list. Okay, so this is the class down here, which is this text here. Now, what this is saying is that if we go to our class, so inside our article, we have a class called portfolio, and then inside that article, any image tag will take on the aspects of this CSS. Okay, so if we put in a width of 100%, okay, our portfolio image is going out to the maximum width of this containing element. Now, the width of this containing element is controlled by our div tag, which is our 50 VW. Okay, so if this was set to 80, then what would happen? Our image would fill that area. Now, the problem that we can have with width is that if our image was only 100 pixels wide and we put width in there, then our image would actually stretch to the width of that containing element. And because it's stretching, it would actually lose quality. So what we need to do is use max width. And what max width does, instead of using width here, so if we put max width is 100%, okay, so it doesn't look any different. But what will happen if we make our max width, because we've got big images here, if I make the max width 20%, all right, if I try and squeeze this down any more, okay, and as you can see, as I bring that up, once that image gets to 20% of that size of that containing element, it'll just stay at that size, it won't move. It's probably not going to work with percentages so well. Let's make that let's make it 200 pixels, then we can because I'm using relative measurements, so obviously it's just going to stretch. My bad. Anyway, so if we go into here, and once that image gets below 200 pixels, you can see that it'll scale. Okay, so what I've done is just changed this, so I've actually got our portfolio list, so this is our containing element. So to see that, as you know, I just tend to use border to find out where things are. Okay, so there's my containing element, and if we do a width, say we do a width of 100%, and we know that it's going to fit 100% of that internal containing element, so 50% means that you can see here we've got our container, and then our 50% is going in here. Now if we resize that, it'll always be 50%. If we do max, we do 100%, then it'll fill that container. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to swap these images. So at the moment we've got max width of 100%. So I'm going to go into this top one, and I'm going to delete that and replace it with a small image. So let's choose that one, and we'll just do small, and just replace that in here. Okay, now the reason why this looks different is because this image down the bottom is a high-res image, so this is very high quality. Now this one is only a lower res quality. Now because we have max width, if I set this to width, what happens, you can see that it actually scales to the width of that containing element. But if this containing element was a lot bigger, let's just make that 80 instead of 50. Okay, you can see that the image itself is losing quality, because what's happening is if we just set a width, it'll fill that containing element, but it won't care whether that image is high quality or not. So when we use a max width, what happens is that our image, instead of just filling out the space, what it'll do, it'll scale until such time as there's a 1-to-1 ratio of pixels. So that's why you can see that's a much smaller image. So that image is now 100% of size. So 100% means that there's no scaling of any pixels at all. So it'll go to the width of the image, but then it won't grow anymore. The image down the bottom, because that's a high resolution image, you can see that that fills out that space no problem. So when you're doing your images, make sure you have fairly high resolution images. So I think 1024 is kind of the minimum. I know that 1080 is another 1200. I think Facebook uses 1200 by 1200. So just make sure that you have a fairly high resolution image in there, otherwise you're going to get this reducing quality. Here's a starting point for your images in your CSS. Have a play around with max width, max height, and just experiment with your images, and just so you get to learn how to get some control over them. Now we're going to look at using different units for font sizing, and it'll just be a short introduction, because it really is about playing around, experimenting, and just understanding the concept behind these things. EMS is a good way to define your font sizing because it's all relative. Percentages work pretty well as well. You can use percentages to do the styling, but because your layouts are sometimes based on spacing between sort of typography, then EMS is a really good way to instigate some control over how your layouts are working. For those who want to do a little bit more with images and just making them work a bit better, there is an advanced section in the CSS that you can check out. It's not difficult, it's just a way that images can be rendered to fit inside a particular size container, and it makes it handy if you want to do like a square or something where you have a fixed shape. Hopefully by the time you finish you'll have something that looks like this, and now it's time to sort of start looking at how we can introduce fonts into this mix. So you can see here we have our standard font spacing, etc. from the browser, and how we can change our values from an absolute value to a relative value. This allows us to control our design using font sizing to control how our spacing, our padding, our margins, etc. all react in our design. So let's experiment with the browser styles as they are. So you can see that if we change our H2 font size to 24 pixels, nothing happens because that's the standard size that our browser is using to render that file. But if we change it to 36 pixels, then you can see that it gets bigger. And because we've sort of absolutely defined the size of that font, then the browser just gets overridden with this particular value. One key thing with using EMS is that our size of our font is governed by the containing element. So for example, if we make our font size in our H2 to EMS, and then we change our article font size to be maybe a fixed value, then you'll see that the value of the two EMS is based on what that article font size is. So if that font size was 50 pixels, for example, then H2 to EMS would be 100 pixels. So that means that there's kind of there's a relationship between how that font is rendered wherever it's placed within that containing element. Now I'll change the font size of the article back to 1M, and you notice that it's relative to the containing element. If we make that like an absolute value, you can see now that it's overridden that particular that sizing. So important thing to remember with EMS is that the size that you change your font to is based on the parameters of the containing element. One way to get out of that is to use, instead of using EMS, we can use rem. Now what rem means is that the font size is based on the root M value. So the root M value is whatever the browser style is. So for example, H2, the root M value would be 24 pixels, and we can use that if we don't want to change how we want that to react. Now most of the time you'll probably want to keep that relationship, just be aware of it, because what happens is when you start looking at spacing, if you're using EMS for spacing, those values will also change according to how much an M is worth. So it's just a matter of experimenting. This is kind of a confusing part of everything, but if you start using EMS and REMS as opposed to using pixels, then your designs will be a lot more fluid. So here you can see that I've changed the font size in the body to be 20 pixels. That means that if we use rem, everything is based on 20 pixels. Now if I go down to the H2 tag, you'll see that that's in rem. So at the moment it's 2 rem, so that's 40 pixels. And if we change you'll notice that if we change this from rem to M, it'll actually increase the size, because now we're doing, this is where line height is important, because as fonts get bigger, the spacing doesn't work so well. So what we need to do is actually reduce the space between the lines. The line that runs along the bottom of the text is called the baseline. the descenders go below that line. Line height is really critical because by default you don't need to actually put in the M value, because it's sort of a considered value where it really is just a default that it uses M's. And you can see that what I'm doing here is just changing that until I get a value that fits with the spacing that I want for that particular element. And even things like margins, so putting margins top and bottom is really important. Sometimes it can be too large, sometimes it can be too small, and it's about having that control. So make sure that you look at your design and see that everything kind of works in terms of a visual style. And you can see there that, you know, putting some padding around it, putting space in between things really does make it look a lot better. If you go to the Google Fonts website, you just look up Google Fonts and it'll take you straight there. And what it does, it lists all the fonts that you can select, and you know, there's quite a few. There's a few hundred, and they're categorized into serif, sans serif, display, handwriting, and monospace. And this allows you to sort of filter out the ones that you're not looking for. I'd get rid of monospace straight away, because really, unless you're writing code examples, you don't use monospace, because that's based on each character having an M space around it, so that, for example, in the old days, you know, when you used typewriters, each character had its own space. That's why they had to put double spaces between the characters. So let's look for a serif font, and then a display. So display fonts are usually designed differently than normal or normal text fonts, because they have different weights and different spacings, and we want to use display. Handwriting is if you're doing a script type font, and then you can just filter out these fonts as you based on your design. Okay, so let's come back with a few options, and some of these I like, and what I'll do is I'll pick one, and then we can see how we can actually use that font. You can customize the text that you put in there to search for. So if you're looking for a particular word that you like, you can actually make those choices and change the font size so you can actually really see exactly what you're getting. And once you find your font, you just select it. Once you've chosen your font, it takes you through to this page where you can see you've got all these different styles of the font. The font face. Fonts usually have Roman, italic, bold italic, and in order to choose them, you've got to make sure that you actually click on each of those buttons on the right hand side there, and they will add it to your collection. Once all these styles have been added to your group there, you can see that they're, as I'm selecting them, they're just going into there. And what that will do is then add to the Google font list. So here you can see that we have our link. So this is the same as using a style sheet. So that's one way that we can get it into our documents. We can also use the import tag. So import means that that'll actually bring in a style sheet into the CSS. So what you notice here is that we have the font family, the title, italic, and the different weights of our fonts, and what we're going to be importing into our CSS document. Now when we use @import, what it means is if we put that at the head of our document, of our CSS, it will load that CSS as the document loads. So that means that we can use this to load our style sheet. We put our import tag at the top of the document, so that's the first thing that gets loaded, and then we can start importing our fonts. So we copy this code. This is our font family which goes in our CSS. We then head back over to the browser or to your CSS document. We can then paste in that font family code, and you notice that now our font has changed and we're now using a different font altogether. The line height is crucial, and currently it's set at 0.9 ems of the font size. Normally you need to go below the standard, which is probably 1.4, simply because you've got a much bigger font, and it really does make a big difference in the way the design works. You can also change your font style to italic, because that will reference the other italic font that I included in the import rule. And you also got a different weight, so you can have a font weight and a font style. Please just have a play around with these things, because they're important, and they're also a bit more fun to customize your design. Adjusting things like margins at the bottom of text, it really makes a big difference to the way the design works. So be careful and be really proactive about making sure that your spacing is good between those text elements. Now this site is really good because what it does, allows you to choose font pairing. So it actually goes through and has a couple of combinations that can work well together. And when you're in Google Fonts, you can actually select more than one font. Now you can see how there's extra fonts been added to the import list. So we just need to copy that into our style sheet again, and then come back and put our new font family into somewhere into the. Once we have this font family copied, we just take it back over to our CSS, and we put it perhaps into the paragraph tag, wherever you want to apply that. And you can see that it's changed the font already. And now we have a nice mix of a serif face and a sans serif face that can work well together. And that's kind of basically how you put Google Fonts into your document. That's about it for today. Sorry it had to be a video, but hopefully you've got something out of this, and try and get some stuff working and see how you go. But until next week, I'll catch you later. Thanks, bye.